Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the jump from employee to supervisor. And we're using this review of Stepping Up, from valued employee to supervisor to guide us.
By Jim Schiffler.
That's right, by Jim Schiffler. This deep dive should help you understand the mindset shift. You need the essential skills and the resilience it takes to succeed as a leader. And the review makes this really interesting point right off the bat. It says leadership is less about what you do and more about enabling your team to do their best work. What do you think about that?
It's a really important point, and I think it's a core part of Schiffler's approach. We often think being a great employee automatically makes you a great leader. But this book says, no, you got to change how you see your value as a leader. It's not about your work. It's about motivating, mentoring, and guiding your team towards a common goal.
Yeah, I can see how that shift in focus would be tricky, especially for those who are used to being top performers. The review mentioned Sarah. She was an amazing sales rep before becoming a team leader, but she really struggled at first because she was used to doing everything herself. Do you think that's common for new supervisors?
Absolutely. It's a classic trap for high achievers. They're used to being in control, taking pride in their individual wins. So letting go can feel like they're losing their identity, almost like giving up their strengths. Schiffler gets this and addresses it directly. He says you have to reframe delegation. It's not a loss, it's an investment. It's about recognizing your team's unique talents and using those talents to achieve something bigger than any one person could alone.
So instead of giving up control, you're actually helping others succeed. That's a big mindset shift. But how do you actually get better at delegating? Saying let go is easier said than done right.
And that's where clear communication comes in. Schiffler says it all starts with setting clear expectations. Explain the desired outcome, the tasks involved, and the level of authority you're giving. But it's not just about giving orders. It's about providing support and encouraging a sense of ownership. He suggests regular check-ins to track progress, offer guidance, and address roadblocks. He even recommends a delegation checklist to make sure you're covering all the bases.
That checklist idea is really helpful. It makes delegating feel more organized and less like guesswork. And it reminds me of something else the review mentioned. Feedback loops. Not just for delegation, but for all communication. What are those exactly, and how does Schiffler say to use them?
Well, he describes feedback loops as a way to have constant communication with your team. You don't wait for performance reviews. You're regularly checking in, dealing with concerns early on, and encouraging open dialogue. It's proactive, so small problems don't become big ones.
So you're creating this open communication where feedback helps people grow instead of just being a one-way critique. That makes sense? But what about when things do go wrong? Like when conflicts arise? The review said Schiffler has a unique take on conflict resolution.
Yeah, he doesn't see conflict as something to avoid. He sees it as a chance to grow and improve. He understands that conflict often comes from different perspectives or unmet needs. By addressing those, you can actually build stronger relationships and improve how your team works. He has a structured approach where you first identify the root of the conflict, then have constructive conversations, and finally find solutions that work for everyone.
So it's not about ignoring the problem or forcing a solution. It's about understanding why the conflict is happening.
Yeah.
I imagine that takes a lot of emotional intelligence from everyone involved. And speaking of emotional intelligence, the review mentioned that Schiffler really digs into this topic and breaks it down into 4 key components.
Yeah, he talks about self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relationship management as a foundation of emotional intelligence, especially for leaders. He believes these skills are crucial for handling those complex relationships, resolving conflict, and building strong bonds with your team.
Okay, so we've got self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and relationship management. These all sound important, but how do they actually work in the day-to-day life of a supervisor? Can you give an example of how, say, self-awareness could help you handle a tough situation with a team member?
Okay, let's say you have a team member who's constantly missing deadlines. Now, your first reaction might be frustration, maybe even anger. But self-awareness lets you take a step back and look at your own emotions before reacting. You might realize you're frustrated because you're worried the project will be delayed, and that'll make you look bad. By recognizing that underlying fear, you can talk to your team member with more empathy and focus on finding a solution instead of just blaming them.
I see. So self-awareness helps you respond in a more constructive way.
It also makes me think about social awareness. What role does that play in being a supervisor?
Social awareness is all about understanding the emotions and perspectives of other people. In that example we just talked about, social awareness might help you see that your team member is struggling with something bigger than just laziness or incompetence. Maybe they're dealing with a personal crisis or feeling overwhelmed. By being in tune with their emotional state and what's happening within the team, you can approach the situation with more sensitivity and maybe uncover some underlying issues.
So it's like being a good listener and observer, not just taking things at face value, but trying to understand why people act the way they do. So social awareness is important, but so is relationship management. What does Schiffler say about that? He argues that strong relationships are the foundation of good leadership. And relationship management is how you build trust, encourage collaboration, and create a positive, supportive work environment. You need to understand everyone's needs and motivations, recognize their contributions, and handle conflicts in a way that respects everyone.
So it's about making people feel valued, respected, and supported, not just as workers, but as people. That makes a lot of sense, but it also sounds like a lot to juggle. And then there's all the new technology you have to keep up with. Speaking of technology, the review mentions that Schiffler is all about using tools like Slack, Trello, and Zoom, which are pretty much essential these days with so much remote work. How does he incorporate those tools into his approach to supervision?
Well, he recognizes that these tools can be really valuable to keep people connected and working efficiently, especially with teams spread out all over the place. But he also warns against relying too heavily on technology and says it's important to maintain that human connection. It's about finding a balance between using technology and making sure you still have those face-to-face interactions.
So it's not technology versus human connection. It's about using technology to make those connections stronger.
That's a good point, and one that I think a lot of leaders are struggling with right now. But what kind of specific advice does he give about keeping those human connections strong in this digital world?
He has some practical tips. For instance, he suggests scheduling regular video calls, even if it's just for a quick check-in, just to see each other's faces and keep that personal connection going. He also stresses being thoughtful about how you use technology. Like, don't just rely on emails for important conversations. Pick up the phone or schedule a video call when you need to talk about something sensitive or give feedback, right? Because sometimes a quick phone call can be so much better than a long email chain. That makes perfect sense. But even with all the right tools and strategies, becoming a supervisor can be stressful. And that leads us to another important topic from the review: building resilience. And before we jump into that, let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor. We'll be back right after this to explore how Schiffler approaches resilience and what advice he has for dealing with the challenges of leadership. So before the break, we were discussing how tough it can be to move from employee to supervisor. And the review mentioned that a big part of the book is about building resilience, which makes sense considering all the pressure that comes with being a leader. What's interesting is that Schiffler goes beyond the usual stuff like mindfulness and exercise and actually tells supervisors to embrace being vulnerable. What do you think that is?
Well, it seems like he knows that the typical image of a leader as someone who's always in control and confident can actually do more harm than good. It creates these unrealistic expectations and makes people afraid to ask for help or admit when they've messed up. By encouraging vulnerability, he's basically saying it's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, asking for help when you need it is a sign of strength.
I like that. It makes leadership seem more human and relatable. But how do you actually practice vulnerability? It's easy to say be vulnerable, but much harder to actually do it.
Especially in a work setting where you might worry about seeming weak or incompetent.
He gives some really practical advice. Like, he suggests sharing your own experiences with self-doubt or times when you've struggled as a leader. That can create a more open environment where people feel comfortable talking about their own problems. He also says supervisors should be transparent about how they make decisions, explaining their thinking, and admitting when they're not sure about something. Being open like that builds trust and makes people feel more involved. So it's like you're showing vulnerability yourself and making it okay for others to do the same. You're changing the whole culture from one where everyone hides their weaknesses to one where everyone accepts that we're all human and make mistakes. That's powerful. But how does this connect to resilience? Does being vulnerable really make you a stronger leader?
Schiffler says that when you can admit your limits and ask for help, you're building a better support system for yourself. You're not trying to do everything alone. He also thinks that by being open about your own struggles, you're giving other people permission to do the same, which can create a more collaborative and supportive team.
It's like creating a network of shared vulnerability, which makes the whole team stronger. It's not just about the leader being tough, it's about everyone supporting each other and learning from their experiences. And speaking of learning from each other, the review mentioned that Schiffler is a big believer in peer support networks. Why does he think those are so important?
He believes that connecting with other supervisors, sharing stories, and learning from each other's successes and failures is so valuable. It's about creating a community where you can talk openly about the tough parts of leadership without being judged.
It's like having a group of mentors who get what you're going through because they've been there themselves. You can vent, brainstorm solutions, and celebrate wins together. But is it realistic to set up those peer support networks, especially if you work in a small company or a more isolated place?
He knows it might take some effort, but he has some ideas, like reaching out to people in similar roles at other companies or joining online groups focused on leadership. The key is to be proactive and go out and find those connections.
So don't wait for support to come to you. Go out and find it. That's a good point.
But before we get too excited, the review did mention a couple of things to consider about the book.
Right. It's important to remember that the book mainly focuses on new supervisors and uses mostly Western examples. So the main ideas are helpful, but you might need to adjust them depending on your specific situation and cultural background. That's really important because not all cultures see leadership or vulnerability the same way. And what works for a brand new supervisor might not be as helpful for someone with years of experience. So it's always a good idea to think about the author's perspective and the limits of any advice or framework. So what stood out to you from what we've discussed so far? Any insights that really clicked with you or sparked your curiosity?
Honestly, the idea that vulnerability can be a strength, especially for leaders, that was surprising, but it makes sense. When you let yourself be more human, you become a more authentic and relatable leader. And that can be incredibly powerful for building trust and inspiring people.
I totally agree. It's a really freeing idea.
Yeah.
And it fits perfectly with what Schiffler says about emotional intelligence, communication, and creating a supportive team. It's like all these pieces work together to create a more well-rounded and human-focused way of leading. And speaking of human-focused, the review praised the book for its writing style, being so clear and engaging.
Yeah, it seems like Schiffler is really good at breaking down complex ideas into easy-to-understand pieces. It feels like you're talking to a mentor, not reading a textbook.
That conversational style can make all the difference, especially when you're dealing with something as complicated as leadership theory. But the review also liked how practical the book is structured.
Definitely. Each chapter has a summary of the key takeaways and action steps, which is really useful for actually putting those ideas into practice. And there are exercises throughout the book that encourage you to think about how those ideas apply to your own life and work.
So it's not just passively reading, it's actively engaging with the material and figuring out how to use it. It's like he's giving you a toolkit for becoming a better supervisor. But even with the best tools, the review did point out a couple of areas where the book could be even better.
True, it mentioned that the part about diversity and inclusion could be more detailed, especially considering how important those topics are in workplaces today. The book touches on them, but it could go deeper into how diversity and inclusion affect leadership and team dynamics.
I see that. And the review also noted that the book might not be as groundbreaking for experienced leaders as it is for new ones. Seasoned managers might find some good reminders, but it seems like the book is really aimed at people who are just starting out as leaders.
Yeah, that seems to be the target audience. But even if
Yeah.
you're an experienced leader, there's always something new to learn. And Schiffler's focus on vulnerability, emotional intelligence, and building a supportive team is relevant for leaders at all levels.
Definitely. Those are timeless principles that can help anyone in a leadership role, no matter how much experience they have. And one of the most interesting things from the book that really stuck with me is this idea that leadership isn't about having power. It's about empowering others.
That's a great point. It connects to everything we've talked about today, from changing your mindset to building resilience and being vulnerable.
It does. And it brings us to a final thought for you to think about. How can you start using these ideas of empowering others in your work right now? Even if you're not a supervisor, how can you shift your focus from your own achievements to helping those around you succeed?
That's a really good question to consider. It reminds us that leadership isn't just a title, it's a way of being. And by focusing on empowerment, collaboration, and support, we can all help create more positive and productive work environments.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe by putting those ideas into action, you'll find yourself in a leadership position sooner than you think. But even if you don't, you'll still be making a difference for your team and your own career. Because in the end, leadership isn't just about titles or positions. It's about how we support each other and work towards something bigger than ourselves.
I like that. That's a good way to put it.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep stepping up. It's amazing how practical and useful this book seems to be. And although there are parts that could be expanded on, like talking more about diversity and inclusion, the main message seems to really hit home. It makes you wonder if Schiffler's own background influences his approach. Did the review say anything about his experience?
You know, it didn't go into a lot of detail, but it did mention that he's had a really diverse career. He started as a regular employee and worked his way up through different leadership roles in various industries. So, all those different experiences probably give him a unique perspective on the challenges and rewards of being a leader.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one thing to read about leadership, but it's completely different to have actually lived it, to have had those wins and losses firsthand. It sounds like he's using those real-world experiences to give advice that's both practical and relatable.
Exactly. And the review pointed out how the book emphasizes being authentic as a leader. And it seems like Schiffler is comfortable sharing his own struggles and vulnerabilities, which makes the book feel more personal and less preachy.
That authenticity can be so powerful,
Yeah.
especially coming from someone in a leadership position.
Hmm.
It makes the whole idea of leadership less scary and more approachable. It's like he's saying, hey, I've been there, I've messed up, and I'm still learning. I think that honesty can be really inspiring for people who want to be leaders.
Definitely. It takes guts to admit your weaknesses, especially when you're trying to be seen as a leader, but it also builds trust and transparency, which can really help how a team works.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
It's like he's showing the kind of vulnerability he wants others to have. And speaking of encouraging people, the review mentioned how this book isn't just about pointing out your mistakes, it's also about celebrating the times you do things, right? It seems like Schiffler really believes in recognizing and appreciating those small victories along the way.
He does. And the review specifically mentioned how the book ends on a really positive and encouraging note. It tells readers to face the difficulties of leadership with a good attitude and a willingness to learn. It's like he's giving you a pep talk, reminding you that leadership is a journey, not a destination.
That's a great message to end with. It reminds us that leadership is all about learning and growing, and that it's okay to make mistakes as long as you keep moving forward. So as we wrap up this deep dive into stepping up, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to remember?
I think it's the power of helping others succeed. It's that shift from focusing on your own achievements to creating an environment where everyone on your team can thrive and do their best. It reminds us that leadership isn't about bossing people around, but about working together, encouraging growth, and celebrating everyone's success.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it really gets to the heart of what it means to be a good leader. It's not about being the smartest person or having all the answers. It's about creating a space where everyone feels valued, respected, and confident to do their best work.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by embracing those ideas, our listeners will find themselves in leadership roles sooner than they expect. But even if they don't, they'll still be making a positive impact on their teams and their own careers. Because ultimately, leadership isn't just about titles or positions. It's about how we support each other and work together towards something bigger.
That's a fantastic way to end this discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into stepping up, from valued employee to supervisor.
It was great to be here.
And to all our listeners, until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep stepping up.